Hello and welcome back to State of the Division, this time bringing you UFC 304. Following up a really solid UFC 303 that brought some really fun fights and some really action-packed moments, this card is okay. I always do love the heavyweight fights, and we get to see some new heavyweight contenders, some possible new people working up the ranks, and then we have the co-main event, which is a heavyweight fight. I'm really looking forward to Aspinall Blaydes 2, because I think Aspinall's looking to kind of cement his standing as the number one contender, and Blaydes is nipping at his heels, and I think Blaydes can put up a really good fight here. The main event, Leon Edwards, Belal Muhammad. This is a big fight with both guys. Leon Edwards kind of looking to cement his title reign, if I want to borrow a wrestling term, and Belal Muhammad's looking to really make us remember the name by making himself a UFC champion, a feat that in the scope of sports, not a whole lot of athletes have done. And I think throughout the card you have a few other interesting fights. The newly named King Green versus Paddy Pimblett has a chance to be really fun and good. And I really do kind of find it fun that they're spotlighting a lot of UK talent in this card, taking a lot of guys and kind of putting them in places they weren't always going to be in a fight. Some guys being fight night veterans, some guys being early prelims fighters. And I think moving them up and down the card in a way that really gets the spotlight some new talent and give them a chance to put their name out there on the MMA stage for all the world to see. And we'll dive right into this. We'll dive right into the card, but first we got some housekeeping and a really confusing butcher's build to look at. I went 8-5 in the last card. Not my best record, but I will take it considering how poorly I started that card. That does bring my overall record for the year to 52, 32, and 2. Those two draws being Junior Tafa and the Dan Ige step-in against Diego Lopez. Both of those just being called a wash due to the last minute replacement after I'd recorded the video. That being said, the 55 and 32 does put me in a really decent spot for this year. It's kind of where exactly I want to be. I'm well over 500, and with the latter half of the year ahead of us, I think it gives me a really good chance to kind of build this lead and put a really good foot forward in terms of my predictions, and also set me up to take bigger swings on fights I think might go hard the other way, even if I wouldn't have felt comfortable doing it when it was much closer before. All that being said, we now need to move into the rather confusing and weird butcher's bill here. First order of business, the thing that's been removed, is the order of my script. I wrote this about 10 days before the fight would start, or started to write it at least, and in the time since I've finished it, fights have all been moved around. You now have opponents in different spots. Fighters have moved up the card, down the card. I think one fight has moved as far as from like the early prelim closer to now a seat on the main card. A main card fight's definitely moved down to the prelims fight. I think one of the heavyweights fights is suddenly somewhere different now. All that being said, there are a few fighters that have been replaced. Firstly, worth noting, fighter replaced. Christian Leroy Duncan now does not face Robert Brycek. He will have a new opponent for his fight. He is facing Gregory Rodriguez. Shauna Bannon is no longer facing Ravenna Oliveira. Shauna Bannon is now facing a call-up whose name I can't pronounce, but we will get to her. She's famous for having an OnlyFans as a fighter. On the prelim card, there's only one replacement worth noting. Loughran, I'm so sorry, is no longer facing Ramon Tavares. He is facing Jake Hadley on a very late call-up compared to the other two fighters. Jake Hadley had about a week-ish notice going into this fight, which I do think will make it at least an interesting fight. All that being said, let's jump into the main card.
15-6, Modestus, the Baltic gladiator Bukauskus, squares off against 17-7, Marcin Prachino. Modestus is 6 years younger at 30, no separation in height, but 4 inches in reach do roll his way. Modestus is a bit of an odd fighter to get a feeling of, with 9 career KO wins but only 1 in the UFC back in 2020, and a majority of his UFC losses coming by KO. I would say he's a striker who relies on power and toughness to hang in against opponents since he doesn't often seem to pull away. In the numbers, he works a 3.28 to 3.97, highlighting his tendency to get stuck in those slugging contests, and as mentioned, he has a history of KOs, but in the UFC has been a relative dead draw in them. In terms of the ground game, he rocks an 0.00 and carries a 71% takedown defense with the ability to survive on the ground and get back to his feet, seen in his wins over Zach Payuga and Tyson Pedro. Prachino is a bit of a different story, despite coming across as a striker. In that regard, he works a 5.61 to 3.30, showing his ability to pour on the quantity and outpace his opponents. He also does seem to lack some KO touch in the UFC, with only 1 in 2021, and his susceptibility to getting fit.
Disagree. Truthfully, this fight's a little hard to gauge. Both fighters mirror each other fairly closely, and it's hard to really gauge who is a step above the other. but I'm really basing this on Prachino's output and the fact that Modestus has really seemed to struggle with pulling away in fights. He only led the striking totals at the end in one of his fights, and he lost that fight, though in fairness, in another he was behind by 1. So I imagine that on the feet, Prachino's going to be able to build a striking total that Modestus is going to have to try to overcome, which puts him on the back foot and makes me give the edge to Prachino.
The Baltic gladiator Bukauskus squares off against 17-7 Marcin Prachino. Modestus is 6 years younger at 30. No separation in height, but in reach do roll his way. Modestus is a bit of an odd fighter to get a feeling of, with 9 career KO wins but only UFC back in 2020, and a majority of his UFC losses coming by KO. I would say he's a striker who relies on power and toughness to hang in against opponents since he doesn't often seem to pull away. In the numbers, he works a 3.28 to 3.97, highlighting he's stuck in those slugging contests, and as mentioned, he has a history of KOs, but in the UFC has been a relative dead draw in them. In terms of the ground game, Rexon Open carries a 71% takedown defense with the ability to survive on the ground and get back to his feet, seen in his wins over Zach Payuga and Tyson Pedro. Prachino is a bit of a different story, despite coming across as a striker, and that works a 5.61 to 3.30, showing his ability to pour on the quantity and outpace his opponents. He also does seem to lack some KO touch in the UFC, with only 1 in 2021, and is susceptible.
Vegas goes with Bannon, and I will agree for lack of really any data here. Ardelean's a hard fighter to get a read on when I'm looking at UFC numbers because a lot of her stuff isn't in the UFC. And Bannon doesn't have a lot of UFC experience, so I'm kind of relying on the number counters here to give me an edge. And in that nose, I think I will go with Bannon, being that she fights like a grinder, and her ability to drag those fight into later rounds may be a plus, because a lot of Ardelean's losses came in those later rounds where she would lose by decision.
11, 2, and 1. Sam, the future Patterson, looks to go 2 in a row against 10 and 4 Kiefer, BDK Crosbie. Patterson is 6 years younger, 5 or 3 inches taller, depending on how the listed heights play out, with a nice and simple 8 inches in reach going his way. Patterson only has 3 UFC fights, but as a whole looks to be a solid submission artist with 2 wins in the UFC by submission and 6 total in his career. Looking at the ground, he has a 1.19 takedown average with 1 landed takedown in his 3 UFC fights, which does show his ability to take advantage of his opponent's takedowns and reverse the position to take control. He doesn't seem to get beat on the ground all that much, but it has been surpassed on the feet twice, which does make sense looking at his 2.54 to 3.41 in striking, that classic grappler striking totals. Crosbie is going into his second UFC fight, based on his 5 KO wins, tends to strike on the feet and rack up high striking totals, as seen in his 39-29 performance against Kevin Hosset, which ended in a first round submission loss. He does seem to be able to go the distance, but as a whole either wins or loses quick.
Vegas leans Patterson, and I will agree. I think Crosbie can win, but he just has a much longer path to victory, and given it seems that his ground game is a weakness, and that's exactly where Patterson wants to go. He wants to be on the ground, he wants to be applying that pressure. It puts him on the back foot. I'm inclined to give the one who works with that advantage the edge in this fight, simply based on that being his weakness and the other being his strength.
10 and 1, Christian CLD Leroy Duncan takes on 15 and 5, Gregory Robocop Rodriguez. Duncan is 4 years younger, 1 inch shorter, with 4 in reach heading his way. Duncan comes into this fight as a finisher, with 3 of his 4 UFC fights ending in KO and him holding the striking lead in all of them. He has a 5.96 to 3.82 in striking average, which highlights how he likes to push the pace and put his opponent on the back foot and take the initiative. Behind the pace, he has KO power with 8 career KO wins, does have a 0.45 takedown average, but that seems very opportunity based over something he consistently looks for, though he only has a 50% takedown defense, and in his loss was taken down once for 3 minutes of ground control time. Rodriguez is also a KO artist, but has a few small differences. In the numbers, he has a 6.08 to 5.30, which does speak to with a slightly higher output and absorbed rate, which shows he is a bit more willing to step in and swing, though this has cost him a few fights where the other opponents have landed their power before he has. As a whole, he does take the striking lead in his fights through the size, though the size of the lead does vary. Also different is the fact that he has a 2.46 takedown average, though it isn't always part of his game plan and seems to be fairly situational or recovery based.
Vegas has this fight close and gives a narrow edge to Duncan, and I think I will agree. Rodriguez has the power and ability to pull away, but on the same note, can get caught in exchanges and finish that way. So I go into this believing that Duncan can match, or at least stay close enough to put some pressure on Rodriguez and force him into slugging exchanges where he can catch him or rock him enough to start building his own striking lead and take control of the flow of the fight.
Taking us out of the prelims, I think. 10 and 2, Oban, the Welsh gangster Elliot, wins best ring name. Takes on 11 and 4, Preston Pressure Parsons. Elliot is 3 years younger at 26. Height is either dead even or 1 inch going to Oban. Definite inch in reach going his way. Elliot is a newcomer with 1 actual fight and 1 contender series fight, but as a whole, he resembles a grinder with 5 career decision wins, and both UFC fights being won that way. Now, in terms of UFC numbers, he works a 4.27 to 2.17 in striking, and his last fight took a demanding striking lead, 70-23. Now, he can be met on the feet to some degree, as seen in his fight with Brito, where Elliot led strikes 58-42. Now, his ground game is also very important and something he relies on in his fights with 3.50 average and 7 total takedowns across his 2 UFC fights, 3 against Woodburn and 4 against Brito. With those takedowns, he can rack up solid control time and even seems to be able to match opponents when he doesn't secure the takedown. Parsons has 4 total UFC fights and is a bit hard to get a handle on. Comes in looking like a grinder with each of his UFC wins coming by decision, but in his career he only has 2 decision wins with 9 submission wins. Either way, the ground game is very important and it shows with a 4.30 average and constant submission attempts every time he lands. As a result of shooting takedowns, he does end up with chunks of ground control time. As a result of all that, his striking lead takes a bit of a hit with a 3.83 to 3.18, but it has seemed good enough in most cases to hang in and get to the ground.
Vegas likes Parsons by a narrow margin, and I can see why, but I think I'm going to run with Elliot here and disagree with Vegas. Now, in part, my reasoning is basically based on the fact that Elliot is better on the feet, and while Parsons looks like he can beat him on the ground, I want to believe that Elliot can at least match or survive on the ground, and if and when they get back to the feet, that's when Elliot can take advantage and suddenly swing the fight in his favor. And I think if he can control that pace on the feet and minimize the damage or time on the ground, I think that's his path to winning this fight, and it's a path I can realistically see happening for him.
Opening the prelim, 9-0, Michael Mick Parkin looks to keep his O against 9-4-1-1. Lucas, the Bull, brzeski. Parkin is 4 years younger at 28, either 1 inch taller, shorter, or dead even depending on what website you read and which height list you trust, with 1 inch reach going to Parkin. Now, Parkin in the UFC has been very much a striking-focused grinder, with his last 3 fights all being decision wins where he outpaces opponents on the feet, or in the case of Machado, limit their offense and control the pace of the fight. Does have KO ability with 5 career KO wins, but none in the UFC. Looking at the numbers, he carries a 4.54 to a 3.94, which does show that he's catchable on the feet, but he hasn't been finished yet. He also packs a pretty effective ground game with a 1.60 takedown average, though it only ever rears its head in specific matchups versus every matchup he has. Brzeski's a bit closer to a generic heavyweight style with a 4.78 to 3.15 in striking, with a handful of fights where the striking is very close in addition to the lack of a real effective ground game, with a 0.48 takedown average. He has shown the ability to survive on the ground against some takedowns, but either way, his opponent was able to gain massive chunks of control time.
Vegas likes Parkin, and being a bit bland, I'm going to agree. As it seems, Parkin is the hot hand and seems to have more paths to victory in this fight. He looks to have the more effective takedown game, and I feel he would be able to hang on the feet given that Brzeski has struggled to get his power out in times, and that really is his great equalizer. Now obviously with heavyweights, one good strike can knock someone out and put him away, so this fight could go the other way, but just looking at it at the numbers that I have and at the screens that I have, I do give the edge to Parkin here.
9-1, Kaulan the Don Loughran goes for 2 in a row against the late replacement, 10-3, Jake White Kong Hadley. Hadley is a whole year younger at 27, 1 inch taller, with 2 inches in reach, also going his way. Loughran is the newer fighter here with 2 fights, 1 win, and 1 loss. And stylistic, once again, I'm sort of lost on what to call him. In the UFC, both his fights have gone to decision, but in his career, he only has 2 decision wins with 5 career KO wins and 2 submission wins. So he has finish ability, but it hasn't shown up yet in the UFC. But using those UFC numbers, he runs a 6.27 to 5.73 in striking, where in his win, he severely outpaces his opponent 104 to 88. Now, in his loss, he was outpaced in turn 84 to 48. But across both fights, his takedown game showed up, which is backed by a 2.50 takedown average. And in both fights, he was able to generate decent chunks of ground control, with a total of nearly 11 minutes split across those 2 fights. Now, as mentioned, Hadley is the late replacement here, but stylistically is a finisher who relies on ending the fight to win. On the flip side, if he can't get the finish, he doesn't get finished in turn. Instead, he goes to decision and loses. This shows up in his striking averages of a 3.36 to 3.56, which shows his willingness to step in and swing, but also to get outpaced on the feet and get finished. There is a small takedown game there with a 0.24 average, but backing that up is ability to reverse position and bring out a dangerous submission game.
Vegas takes Loughran by a decent margin, and I will agree. I'm always hard-pressed to pick a short-notice replacement for a fight, and especially one who struggles with going the distance. Especially against Loughran, who has proven the ability to go the distance, in addition to having the ability to finish. If you look at kind of side by side, Loughran simply checks a few more boxes for me than I'm looking at Hadley. Loughran's been in camp longer, Loughran can go the distance or finish, Hadley seems to rely on the finish and isn't coming into this with a full camp prepping for Loughran. Obviously, Hadley could land a random shot or land the power shot and put it away, but I just think as it stands, Loughran ticks a few more boxes for me than Hadley does.
14-6, Molly Meatball McCann takes a 9-4-1 Bruna, the special one, Brasil. Brasil is 4 years younger, 2 inches taller, with 3 inches in reach. Going her way. McCann has been a finisher as of late, with every fight since 2021 ending by finish and only one going to the third round. 5'7" to 4'9" shows her striking numbers and I think represents her style pretty well, where she doesn't always pull away but is able to keep some sort of lead that gives her an edge on the points. Not to say she hasn't been outstruck, but is almost never by a large margin. Additionally, backing this all up is her strike variety and ability to pour the pace on early, and behind that offense is her takedown submission game with a 1.82 takedown average that makes a regular appearance in most of her fights and gives her chunks of control time in her fight. Her submission game is good, but it has been turned against her by some competition. Moving to Brazil, I honestly don't have a great read on her style, but in her career she runs with 3 KO, 2 submission, and 4 decision wins. In the UFC, she has 1 decision and 1 KO win, and 1 decision and 1 KO loss. In the numbers, she has a 294 to 392 in striking, which does show how she has been outpaced on the feet so far in her losses. On the ground, she works with a 1.59 takedown average, and while she can consistently land takedowns, that faster game can be mitigated by some opponents, which puts her at a really big disadvantage.
Vegas likes McCann, and I will agree. And it really comes down to she just seems to have the better numbers. She's been able to win fights with relatively more consistency, and despite some of her losses, she looks like a contender with how she can win the fight in a quick moment. And just comparing to Brazil, she just stacks up a little better. I think Brazil could win the fight. I just think there are more favorable things going towards McCann.
Ending these prelims, 19-6, Nathaniel the Prospect Wood looks for the rebound against 28-15-0-3, Daniel the Pit Pineda. Wood is 8 years younger at 30, but Pineda is 1 inch taller, with the reach being a dead draw across the board. Wood comes across as a pretty well-rounded grinder, capable of working on the feet and mixing in takedowns to disrupt his opponent's offense and keep the flow going his way. Striking is pretty solid with a 5'9" to 4'22", which does highlight the grinding style where he builds a small but decent lead and holds it till the end of the fight. There doesn't seem to be any real KO power lurking in the wings, but overall the style is completely functional. In terms of takedowns, he works a 1.74 average with a tendency to rack those totals up for chunks of control time, but more importantly, the style puts the flow of the fight into his hands. There's a small submission game there, but he hasn't landed one since 2019. Pineda is a finisher who thrives in being able to end the fight quick, either on the ground or on the feet. He does seem to struggle with going the distance, with 4 of his 6 UFC losses coming by decision. In the numbers, he works with 309 to 3.18 in striking, which does highlight his tendency to swing and bang and let power be that decider. On the ground, he has a 1.71 takedown average and seems to be consistently land them to varying results, where in some fights giving him a bunch of control time, and others being small 30-second chunks. There is a submission game that he seems to be able to work off his back for, but the consistency of that is up in the air.
Vegas likes Woods by a bit, and once again, I'm going to agree. Pineda is just so inconsistent in his ability to win a fight, to bring out the power, to suddenly make a sudden explosive push, and Woods simply has more paths to victory. And with a tendency to go the distance and drag these fight out these long rounds, it just makes me think it's going to go his way, as he'll be able to endure, drag out, slow down, or exhaust Pineda and prevent him from getting the shot he wants or the moment he wants to win the fight.
Starting off the main card, I think 12-0-0-1, Muhammad the Punisher Mokaev takes the octagon against 19-6 Manel Starboy Kape. Mokaev is 7 years younger at 23, 3, 2, or 1 inches taller, reach being 2 inches, definitely going to Mokaev. Mokaev is a ground-focused fighter with a dangerous submission game and persistent takedown attempts. On that note, he averages 5.75 in terms of takedowns, is able to use them to rack up chunks of control time, in addition to letting him attempt submissions on the regular, many of which he will sink. Now, he doesn't seem to give up much to his opponents in terms of getting taken down. In terms of striking, he's very much a standard wrestler striking. He has a 1.53 to 1.36. It's not amazing, but it's functional enough to let him get to the ground and go forward with his game plan. Kape is a little bit of an all-rounder with some KO ability on the feet with a dynamic striking style. On that note, he works a 5.12 to 4.51 with some power sitting in the wings to keep his opponents on the back foot. Additionally, he is capable of working the points and playing for decisions. Takedown percentage is 0.65, which shows it as a tool in his toolbox where he can disrupt an opponent's offense and give him a chance to recover.
Never favors Mokaev, and I will agree. I think Kape could win with an explosive moment or lucky shot, but I think Mokaev, the power of his takedowns, the ability to rack up submissions and control time off of them, puts Kape in a very dangerous situation where one missed moment will put him out of a fight. And while he can win the fight in a single moment, Mokaev has a bit of a chin, and with his kind of style has been able to weather shots before to get to the ground. And I don't know if Kape can finish him off.
19-3, Arnold Almighty Allen looks to get back on track against 15-3, Giga Ninja Chikadze. Allen is 5 years younger at 30, but Chikadze is 3 or 4 inches taller, with reach being 4 inches of reach in favor of Chikadze. Allen comes across as a striking-focused grinder, with 6 of his 9 UFC wins being by decision, though there is some finishability lurking around those wings. Not so much a power-based finisher, but more of a swarming quantity-based one. In striking, he works with a 3.39 to 2.91, which does speak to how he keeps the totals fairly low and instead tries to keep the pace in his wheelhouse where he can dictate it. He can be overwhelmed on the feet, but in the UFC, the only fighter who seemed to do so was Max Holloway. In terms of the ground game, he works at 1.02, which speaks to it acting more so as a recovery or disruption tool. Chikadze is a striker with some serious finishing power and a very dynamic striking style, with 3 KO finishes in his last 4 wins. I will also say he can be matched on the feet by some fighters, but that is not that common with his style. He doesn't have much of a ground game, a .23 average, mostly uses recovery disruption, plus there's to mention he does have previous experience as a kickboxer.
Vegas likes Allen by a decent margin, and while I disagree with the amount of favoritism going to Allen in this fight, I am going to agree. I think Chikadze can win. That's very much why I'm not counting him out. I think he has a legitimate chance. But looking up to his 2 losses, Allen was doing a very good job at controlling the pace of fights and mixing in his ground game. And while Chikadze can match him on the feet, that ground game I think sets them apart. And while Chikadze can keep him at distance and he might survive, if Allen gets it to the ground, puts him against the cage, and gets those chunks of control time, I think the fight swings his way pretty hard.
32, 15, 1-1, the man, formerly known as Bobby King Green, takes on 21-3 Patty the Baddie Pimblett. Pimblett is 8 years younger, dead even height across the board, and 2 inches in reach, rolling to Patty. Green is a solid striker with good finishability while also being able to slow the fight down and limit his opponent's offense. Striking carries a 6.45 to 3.75, which has highlighted his ability to keep his opponent in his wheelhouse while mitigating the damage coming back his way. As already mentioned, he also carries some KO power that he can bring out at will, which always keeps people on their toes. He's also able to rely on some takedown game, generate control time while also disrupting offense. It does sit at 1.19, but only sparingly uses it, so it seems like a more reactionary tool. Pimblett is a bit of an all-rounder with solid striking, backed by some KO ability, a submission game, and the consistent ability to land takedowns, which lets him control his opponent's offense. He runs a 5.13 to 3.70 in striking, with the aforementioned power serving as an additional threat. Now, he often does take the lead, has been able to work with some tight contests in the ground game, carries a .98 average, is able to use it to set up submissions or just hold control time for the decision win.
Vegas has us dead even here, and taking away my easy out, I think I will roll Patty here. My big thing is the 8-year age advantage, plus the little bit more of a well-rounded nature that I've seen from him so far compared to Green. Because while Green can wrestle and can strike, we see moments where parts of his game just get shut down in fights, or some fighters simply erase that aspect from being a threat. And while I don't know if Patty will do that, I don't think he will in this fight, I think Patty's able to adapt and move well enough that Green's going to be having to fight harder and harder, having to rely on everything being good, while Patty's going to be able to match or at least survive the worst that Green can throw at him to win the fight.
For the co-main event, bring on the heavyweights. Interim and basically actual champ 14-3 Tom Honey Badger Aspinall looks to add to his run by running it back against the always dangerous 18-4 Curtis Razor Blaydes. Aspinall is 2 years younger, 1 inch taller, but 2 inches in reach. Head to Blaydes. Aspinall's a very well-rounded heavyweight, but really rocks monster striking with 5 KO wins in the UFC and his 2 other wins being submission. On the feet, he rocks a 7.72 to 2.77 and tends to finish his fights quick, only 1 UFC fight making it out of the first. Now, in terms of the ground, he does bring some solid wrestling with a 3.46 takedown average, which is very good at switching the pace of a fight and disrupting the offense of other fighters, disrupting the offense that other fighters may be trying to get going. Backing that up is a sneaky submission game that's a little inconsistent, but poses a lurking threat. Blaydes is similar in the sense he has a pretty well-rounded game, but he does have some different numbers and uses the style a little differently. He packs dangerous power, is able to work the numbers well, shows up in a 3.53 to 1.83 average in striking. He doesn't tend to land too many shots, ending some fights in the single-digit striking totals, and others getting him up into the low 70s. He also backs us up with a dangerous ground game, capable of taking massive chunks of control time while also setting up ground and pound. I will say he doesn't really have a submission game. He does have, I believe, 2 rear naked chokes, but he doesn't really seem to go for the submission too much. He wants to ground and pound control or put you out.
Vegas picks Aspinall, and it makes sense given the sheer variety of ways that he can win a fight. But I think I'm going to disagree. This isn't based so much on hard numbers, hard facts, hard logic, or trends. It's a bit of a gut feeling, blatant favoritism, and the fact that these guys match up pretty close to each other, and this fight can end in a single instance. Numbers-wise, they were a bit different. I know Blaydes is numbers-wise a little worse of a striker, But at the same time, I think with these guys, they're pretty even in terms of striking. Blaydes has a really good wrestling game that I think he can mix in this fight, because we've seen him survive against really good ground game fighters like Jailton Almeida. And I like to believe if he can match up with Jailton Almeida, he can at least survive or match up somewhat with Tom Aspinall. And obviously this is blatant favoritism, as I said. I really do like Blaydes as a fighter. But I think Blaydes has all the tools to win. It's going to come down to one big moment or one key decision in this fight. And I think that Blaydes has the ability to make that right decision to catch Aspinall in that moment. Hell, this also could be completely wrong, because I think Aspinall's a really great fighter and has a lot of ways to win this, because he can submit or finish or go to decision. The thing is that Blaydes can get a submission. Doesn't do it often, but he can. He can finish you on the feet. He's done it a lot recently, and he's gone to decision before. I think these guys match up really well together. I think it's more of a 50-50 than Vegas has it.
For the main event, 22-3-0-1, Leon Rocky Edwards looks for the title defense against 23-3-0-1, Belal, remember the name, Muhammad. Edwards is 4 years younger, 2 or 3 inches taller, with 2 in reach also going his way. Edwards is a remarkably solid fighter who brings a fairly well-rounded game to the table, with some KO power sitting in the wing. On the feet, he works a decently varied style and rocks a 2.75 to 2.34 average. That does speak to how he will get hit in exchanges, but he has been able to consistently come out on top in these exchanges. He does have power, but it more so lurks in the wings and comes out of nowhere. In terms of his takedowns, he carries a 1.25 average that he uses to disrupt his opponents and gain some chunks of control time. He can throw submissions, but it's not a consistent appearance in his fight. Belal is the definition of a grinder. The ability to stack takedowns, to rack control time up, and simply prevent his opponents from getting their offense going in any sort of way. In the striking, he carries a 4.55 to 3.64, which does speak to how he won't necessarily leave his opponents in the dust, but will consistently be applying pressure and making them come back at him. On the takedown side of things, he works a 1.98 average, and while that doesn't always shoot the thread, but is always there, and he can work off that thread to keep his opponents on the back foot and help him set up other parts of his offense.
Vegas rolls with Edwards, and at the end of this card, I think I will agree. I don't think Belal Muhammad is bad. I think he has an excellent chance to win this fight. But my thing is with Edwards is that they've matched up once before. It didn't end the way anyone wanted it to. But I think Edwards has a lot of tools in his toolbox that allow him to match Belal, or at least prevent Belal from taking control of the fight as he wants to grind. Edwards can push a pace or cede a pace, but never let you gain full control. He's good at limiting his opponent's offense while not giving up control time or giving up control of the fight. And the way Belal fights is that he takes control of that. He wants to control the pace. He wants to control what's happening. He wants to grind you into dust. And I think Edwards is going to be able to either survive or negate the worst of that and give himself a chance to win that way. So in the end, I'm going with Edwards.
Well, that's UFC 304, and I think you can see now from top to bottom, it's a pretty fun card. Your two main events bring a lot to the table. I always like seeing other heavyweights fights. Green Pimblett should be fun. I'm looking forward to the Mokaev fight. I think Mokaev is a fighter on the up and up. I think all throughout this card, you're going to see moments of flashes of these really new kind of up-and-coming fighters going to be worth seeing in the future. That being said, leave your opinion in the comments. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you'd pick against. And in the end, have a great fight.